Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 2025 PIBBSS Symposium. Our speaker is Franz Nowak, and he'll be discussing the mechanics of counting in transformers. We'll save questions until the end. Franz, take it away.
Thank you. So this is a presentation of the results from a time module study on counting in transformers. That is the result of the PIBBSS project at Simplex with mentors Adam Shai and Paul Riechers. This is in the context of trying to understand language models as world models. And a very simple way of modeling the world is to have states and then transitions between the states. There's in formal language theory a concept of different levels of machines or automata or models that do this type of computation. And at the lowest level of this, we have regular languages. And above that, context-free, context-sensitive, and recursively enumerable languages, they are all inclusive of the level below. And what this ranking means is basically how complex are these languages to model? Like, how complex does a machine need to be in order to model this language? There's a one-to-one correspondence between these language levels and models of computation. So for regular languages, for the lowest level, the machine that can accept them or that can process them are finite state automata. You can think of them as finite HMMs that don't necessarily have to have weights in their transitions. So what that looks like is here on the right, we have a very, very simple finite automaton that has 3 states, 1, 2, 3. It has an arrow going into state 1, which means that it's the initial state. Then it has labeled transitions. So if it sees an A, it goes from state 1 to state 2. If it's in state 2 and it sees a B, it stays in state 2. If it sees a C, it goes into state 3. And the double circle line or the double line around the third state means that it's a final or accepting state. So at this point, the machine would accept a string. This is, as I said, the simplest model of computation. If you want to accept languages that are one level higher, namely the context-free languages, which is for a long time how people thought about human language, because it allows you to model for example, hierarchical information, sentences that are decomposed into sub-sentences and recursion. And for that, basically what you need is a push-down automaton, which you can think of as a finite state automaton that also has a stack data structure that it can use. So it can push things onto the stack and can pop things from the top of the stack. But importantly, it can only access the last thing that was pushed into the memory. Then the next 2 levels are described by Turing machines, which you might have heard of in the context of transformers being potentially Turing complete or not Turing complete. There's a whole lot of research in the literature about what kind of these machines can be approximated by transformers. And for these context-sensitive languages and recursively enumerable languages, what you need is a finite automaton that has access not just to a stack, but to a tape, which means that you have some infinite memory or like arbitrarily large memory to which the machine can read and write using a read and write head. And when you have a Turing machine, basically you can compute arbitrary programs. Anything that you can code in a Python program, for example, can be computed by such a machine. So the underlying backbone is always a finite automaton, but then the data structure that you have in addition determines how powerful it is and what kind of languages it can accept. Now we can look at it in a slightly philosophical way and say that technically everything can be modeled as a state machine if you get rid of the assumption that you only have finitely many states. So instead of saying we have a finite state machine with a stack, we could instead say we have an infinite state machine where each state also includes the current stack configuration. And then the important thing is that we have to model the transitions between the states, and that needs to be known beforehand, so we need to compute that in some way. That's why this is not a very practical model for modeling a push-down automaton or a Turing machine, because if you have infinite states, how do you know what transitions to take? You have to basically, for any input length, create a new state machine. Now, it's been shown that transformers that have only finite number of layers and also finite precision, which we usually have in reality, so if we have floating point numbers with 16 bits or 32 bits, they cannot even represent all finite state automata at arbitrary lengths of input. However, when we look at the practical performance of transformers, they're very good at modeling language, which, as I said before, has been assumed to be context-free or even context-sensitive. So they seem to be very good at approximating language or approximating languages that are even above the slowest level of the Chomsky hierarchy. So what about these languages? Like, how can transformers model them if technically they can't do this with their finite architecture? One way that they could do this is by, for each non-regular language, finding the closest finite representation and just learning that. And then it wouldn't work for unseen input sizes, but it would at least work for any practical input size. That would mean that the data distribution that you use to train determines how well a transformer can model these languages, and it can't generalize very well. On the other hand, maybe there's a mechanism in transformers that can simulate these data structures that are required in addition to the finite state machine in order to basically be able to generalize across input lengths, because it's a formalism that extends beyond what it's seen during training. So let's look at a toy problem, like one of the simplest languages that is not regular, so can't be represented by a finite state machine, is parenthesis matching, also called the Dick language. And this is the language of correctly matched parentheses. So you have, let's say you have like open and closed parentheses, and you can never see a closed parenthesis that hasn't previously been opened. And in our specific setting, we don't actually care about necessarily whether the whole string is a valid string of parentheses, because we only want to know whether at each position all the symbols so far have been valid. So we can say that if we open more parentheses than we close, then it's always a valid prefix of a string that is correctly matched parentheses. And in this setting, we also make it a probabilistic setting, because transformers are, and generally language models, don't just model whether something is correct or incorrect. Instead, it gives you a distribution over the next token. So to be as close as possible to this setting, we make the language probabilistic and say that we have an opening probability of 50% and also a closing probability of 50%, except at the boundary conditions. So if we have the first position in a string, that can never be a closing parenthesis because we haven't opened one before. But if we can open either open or close, then each should be equally likely. And then we can see here a lattice of the possible valid sequences for the first 8 symbols. Basically, if you think of an open parenthesis of going up one level and slightly to the right, and then a closing parenthesis going down and to the right, then firstly, we can never dip below the lowest level, because then we would be closing something that wasn't open. And then these are all the possible valid sequences. So we could just open, 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 close, close, close. We could open, open, close, close. And you already see that there's there are some states that can be reached by different means. So for example, like this 0 state here can be reached either by opening 2 and closing 2 or by opening, closing, opening, closing. So there's some duplication where the same state can be reached through different sequences. In order to parameterize this language class, we have two things that we need to determine. The first one is how many types of parentheses do we actually want to allow? So we have n is the number of types. So if we have one type, we just have the round parentheses, and then we can add arbitrarily many other ones. And the second parameter is if we only allow a certain number of, or like a certain depth of nesting parentheses, then parameter m will be the maximum nesting depth. And that's the number of unclosed parentheses of any type at a given position. So here I've taken a string and annotated the nesting depth. So if we open one, we are in nesting depth 1, and then we open something else, we're nesting depth 2, and so on. And when we close, we go back to a shallower depth. So if we have only one type of parentheses, which is the typical setting of parentheses matching as the one of the simplest non-regular languages, then actually what we need is just to count how many open and closed parentheses we had. So we can label the states of a simple finite automaton that can accept this language by the number of currently open parentheses. So in the beginning, we have no open parentheses, and then we have to open one because that's the only legal move. Then we have one open parenthesis, and then we can either close one or we can open another one. And so the label of the state is just the number of open parentheses minus the number of closed parentheses. So what we have here is basically a addition and subtraction task. If we have more than one type of parentheses, however, then this doesn't work anymore because in order to correctly nest, we can't just keep track of how many parentheses we've opened. We have to also know what was the last type of parenthesis that was opened, because that is the one that needs to be closed if we want to close. And so that requires a stack data structure. So yeah, if we have more than one type of parentheses, we can still create a problem that only requires counting by saying we don't actually care about the correct order of parentheses. So we allow sequences like this, where we open one type, open another type, close the first type, and then close the second type. This is then called shuffled for two types of parentheses. And now what we have, if we have a finite nesting depth, then we can always represent this language or accept this language with a finite state automaton. However, you need to note that the number of states of this finite state automaton, or HMM, grows linearly if you have only one type of parentheses, and otherwise it grows exponentially. So you have this tree of possible sequences where if you open something and then the next thing you can open multiple things, you go one level lower, and you have this exponential growth. But yeah, even for a finite state automaton for just the DIC1 language, you have to have more and more states, linearly many states. Now, there has been some literature on what transformers are able to do in this formal language world. There was a study in 2020 that showed that finite state machines can be learned by transformers under certain conditions, and they can also represent counters potentially. However, they didn't look into exactly how transformers do this, but they found empirically that counting is a possibility. And that means that they can recognize constant depth parenthesis matching for one type or even for multiple types if you don't care about the order of the parentheses types. And this even generalizes. However, they found that this only works if you don't actually have any positional encodings. So the only order preserving information is causal masking. Then there was a study in 2023 that showed that for multiple types of parentheses, as long as it's finite nesting depth, transformers can also learn them, but they can't generalize to deeper nesting depths. They can only generalize to longer sequences. And for this, they define some custom positional encodings, which aren't really used in reality. So it's a bit out there. But these are the main results that have been known. And then for the theory of what transformers can represent, there was a study quite recently that for bounded dict languages, transformers have to grow in their model dimension linearly in the input length, and hence also in the nesting depth. So they can't just have a finite constant dimension and recognize bounded languages that are where the bound increases. And this is in contrast to RNNs, where for the same nesting depth, you can have one RNN with a finite constant hidden dimension that works on any input length. So there's a difference in architectures that allows for this. However, it was also shown that if you want to have like more nesting depth, then RNNs again need to grow linearly as well in the nesting depth. All right, so now we come to some experiments to look at how transformers actually do this counting and how they can recognize these languages by looking at the activations. For now, we just consider sequences that have a finite nesting depth. And for now, let's also assume that we always start in a fully closed state. That means we never start a sequence with a closing parenthesis. And then we have 50-50 opening or closing probabilities. And we can form some hypotheses based on the theoretical and empirical literature that we know, and then test it and also look at a PCA of the residual stream activations to see how transformers actually represent the histories of parenthesis sequences. And then we can compare it to a hypothesis. So the expectation is if we have a nesting depth n, then there are n+1 states in the FSA or HMM. That means we start in a fully closed state, we're on the left here, and then from then we always know which state we're in based on what we see, but we require n+1 states to fully express where we are in the sequence, which would also mean we need probably something linear in the number of states to represent these sequences in a transformer. So if we look at nesting depth 2, which means that we have 3 states, and we perform PCA on the residual stream activations, we actually get these 3 clusters, which very nicely fit into this 2-dimensional picture, where almost basically all of the variance is contained in these 2 dimensions. So we can say the data is 2-dimensional. So now, given that if we assume that the previous experiments and theorems were right, that we need linear dimensions for in the number of states of the FSA, it means we need something that's linear in the nesting depth. So we would expect a line that looks something like this. Here we actually have x equals y, so the x-axis is the nesting depth and the y-axis is the number of dimensions. That would be the naive way. Maybe there's a smarter way where you don't need exactly 1 dimension per added state, but we would still expect this to grow linearly. So let's look at what actually happens. If we have higher nesting depth, we train on sequences that require more and more states. What we actually see is that there's some up and down movement here. The yellow line is where PCA contains 95% of the variance. So like how many principal components do we need to have 95% of the variance? That seems to be around 2. If you want basically all of the variance, it fluctuates between 2 and 4. But it never really goes up, and sometimes it even goes down. So there's something going on that doesn't look at all like the linear picture that we expect. So let's look at this. First of all, there's one thing that we noticed, which is that in this task that we set up, if we have the first state always being a fully closed state, then the first symbol we can see is always an open parenthesis. And so what this means is that we can only reach a fully closed state in positions 0, 2, 4, and 6, because we go from fully closed to open, and then we can go back to fully closed, or we go open, open, close, close. This is always an even number of symbols. So the only positions that see state 0 are even positions. And then similarly, the only states that can be odd are in odd positions. And so in order to counteract that, we can just take the first two states as initial states, and we randomly choose which one we start in. And this way, we can see a closing parenthesis in the beginning because we start in a state where we've already assumed we've opened one parenthesis before. And then let's look at some activations. So here, this is we have a two-layer transformer, which is the smallest transformer that learns the task very well. And in the first layer, we look at how the residual stream activations look in PCA. And we have nested of 7, so we need to model 8 states. So what is this variation? Because technically we want 8 states, so ideally what we would see is just 8 very tight clusters, right? But that's not what we see. We see this slightly extended thing where the colors represent the state, so the number of open minus close parentheses. And the first thing to note is that the colors here show that it's actually in a very nice line where we go from the number of open minus close parentheses, which we now have to include a -1 because we allowed the first symbol to be a closing parenthesis. And then the activations very neatly go along this line, so we can linearly separate them along this line as a count from -1 to 7. However, there's more variation here. So let's see. One is that we found that we have these different tracks that sort of run in parallel. And what they are from is that for each position, you get a slightly offset number line. And then for this cluster being elongated in the other direction, this is because if we have multiple histories, like I said before, multiple sequences that can lead to the same state, they can still be differentiated by the transformer, and so it will lead to slightly different activations. They're still separated nicely along this line, but they are clustered along like an interpolated line between them, where, for example, if we open, open, close, close, that is technically the same as open, close, but they look different to the transformer because we have position embeddings that can differentiate these two very well. And then the last one is that actually, if we rotate a bit, we see that there's, in fact, 2 tracks where it still differentiates the even positions and the odd positions, more or less. There's a little bit of overlap with some odd positions being over here, but overall, it's very nicely separated between the odd positions and the odd counts, and the even positions and the even counts. So as we heard before, in empirical studies, it was shown that removing positional embeddings helps transformers learn this task. So let's look at a transformer trained with no positional embeddings or nope. So if we have no positional embeddings, immediately the picture becomes much clearer. We don't have the elongation in the horizontal direction anymore. We still have the different positions. A reason why different positions give you different points in the PCA space is that for each position, you are using a tension that computes the softmax over all the previous positions, and you get different numbers of elements that you're summing over. So this is a highly nonlinear process. So in the end, you get different points for things that you sum that should give you the same sum. And the other thing is that we can still see the colors representing the counts, and the counts are very nicely separated along a line. And if we look at a single pair of positions here, like one even and one odd, then we see these two lines. If we go from -1, this is actually the 0 appears on both sides of this track. So what we found instead is that they're no longer separated by odd positions only occurring for odd counts only occurring on odd positions, but instead we have these two tracks that correspond to whether the current symbol that we see or that the transformer sees is a 1 or a 0. So one track goes for the ones and one track goes for the zeros, and then even positions and even counts and odd counts appear on both sides, and same goes for even and odd positions. So what happens for the number of dimensions that are needed in order to represent this? If we do PCA, in order to account for all of the variance, in fact, now we have a very, very low number of dimensions. It's actually 1 or 2 at the most. So it immediately becomes clear that the activations are even more compressed and even more clustered, such that we don't need many dimensions to model them. This is in the first layer. And if we have this is for a single initial state. In the first layer, we actually see that in most cases, we're along a line perfectly. So we actually really only need one dimension. In the second layer, it sometimes requires more dimensions, but it's still a very, very low number, far under the expectation. And here in the second layer, we can also see that it's very ordered. These multiple positions in the space are, again, the different positions in the sequence, but they're very nicely separated along a line, but you have these two tracks, so you need 2 dimensions instead of 1. So what we've seen here is the reason why no position encodings helps a transformer count, which is that if we have 2 sequences where the prefixes are permutations of each other, they shouldn't be differentiated by the transformer. And that is simplified by if you don't have position embeddings, then the transformer cannot differentiate them at all anyway, because the attention is commutative for the context, because we're summing over all the previous positions and all the vectors of the previous positions. The sum is commutative, so we can not differentiate it anymore. And this helps them learn this task very well. But for now, we've always had this very, very structured task where we always start in the fully closed state. And so we don't really learn all possible sequences of open and closing parentheses. So if we want to actually model counting with +1 and -1, we should get rid of this structure a bit more. And the simplest way to do this is that we take our finite state machine, and instead of always starting in the fully closed state, or maybe in the state that has only one parenthesis opened, we use a uniform distribution over all states. And now we don't have what we had before, which is that in the beginning we always have to open, or we almost always have to open. We still have that if we start in one of these, at some point we will reach the end or the maximum nesting depth. It might be after a different number of times. And if we start further on the right and we close, at some point we will hit the fully closed state still. So there's still some ordering information, but it's much more distributed. So it's much harder for a transformer to learn. And as we can see, if we use learned position embeddings, suddenly we need a lot of dimensions in order to model this. So even for 6 or 7 nesting depth, we already need more dimensions than we have states in the ideal finite state machine. And if we look at the activations here, we still see that there is some clear ordering. So this color gradient with blue, green, yellow, red, and brown is still ordered according to the actual state. So the number of open and close parentheses, like open parentheses minus the number of close parentheses, but it requires many more dimensions. So it's a bit more distributed in the space. If we don't use position encodings, again, we see that we can actually represent it perfectly with a sublinear number of dimensions. And looking at the activation space, we can see why, which is that, again, all these, like this is only for one couple of positions, but we can see that all these different histories and these clouds of embeddings that are equivalent under our definition collapse into just single pairs of embeddings in the PCA space. So now the question is, does this this way of embedding counts help transformers to generalize, which it seems to do, but we want to look into more how they like how the activations look like for sequence lengths that haven't been seen and nesting depths that haven't been seen, and then make these really, really large. So these are the next experiments we want to run. And finally, the last question is, can we find embeddings that look like this, but in large language models that were trained on language data? So the idea here is that if we take an LLM trained on billions of tokens and we give it a task, maybe through in-context learning, that is parenthesis matching or a similar counting task, and we look at the activations, will we find that it orders them in the same way along a line? So these are the next steps in this project. But for now, these are the results for our toy model. Thank you very much. That's the end of the presentation. Let me know if you have any questions.
It seems we don't have questions from the audience. Carlo, do you have a closing question?
No. Okay. Thank you, Franz.